Yeah.
And what does parsimony mean here?
Parsimony is specifically a loss of simplicity, a principle of ontological economy. It's in reference to if two hypotheses have equal explanatory power, or it doesn't have to be equal, but outside of explanatory power, if hypothesis posits less entities or propositions is going to be simpler. Meaning, like, let me give you an example. So let's just say you have two hypotheses. One is during the quarantine, when you were in an online call, there's a hypothesis that the reason why your microphone was unmuted is because you clicked the mouse to unmute yourself. And the other hypothesis is that the demons from the underworld came specifically to your room and unmuted you. Both perfectly explain on the first glance how you got unmuted. But the one which you're gonna take, obviously, is the first one. Well, obviously, because why the fuck would you posit that demons from the underworld came to your room and unmuted you? You understand what I'm saying?
It just seems in this instance that both do not perfectly provide an explanation.
No, they both give some of explanatory power or a possible explanation in which leads to a conclusion. So in that case, unless you want to dwell into it further, on first glance, it is going to be equal explanatory power because that's how you posit parsimony. So unless it is contradicted,
so all I understand parsimony to be, right, is proportional to a certain claim. Another claim, we'll call this claim X, just makes fewer assumptions while still explaining the data or observations.
Yeah, that is going to be parsimony.
Yeah, so you're just saying that cognitivist views make fewer assumptions while still explaining whatever non-cognitivism can explain?
Yeah.
Could you give an example of this?
Yeah, so what I take non-cognitivism to be when it comes to moral utterances is non-propositional language in which an agent is trying to express something about moral statements or like moral sentences, which is not in a form of like them being true or false, them being good or bad, but it's rather trying to show an attitude, right? It's rather trying to show, like, for example, well, if abortion is wrong or something, you say boo abortion in a way, and you're trying to express that attitude. But then, and you would have to hold to this boo abortion and these other utterances because you don't take the moral statements being true or false. So I'm just asking, like, if you don't reduce this boo abortion to some proposition which is like abortion is wrong, what does the statement like boo abortion mean? What does it explain more in comparison to propositions?
I mean, I'll be honest. I respect you, so I'll answer your question, but I expect you to answer mine after because I feel that was a burden shift.
Okay, sure.
But that's completely fine. So
no, you don't have to answer it, then. You don't have to answer it.
I will for the sake of it. I mean, it seems that you're asking, what's it called? If you know, boo abortion are sentences that express negative attitudes towards something or positive attitudes to something. You're asking if they can't reduce to something that's propositional. What does it even mean or explain? What does it reduce to? Is this what you're asking?
Yeah, if it doesn't reduce to a proposition. That.
Okay, well, it seems that this is
so
more
hard,
of a perspective
bro,
thing. I believe most non-cognitivists would just clarify that this meaning wouldn't come from truth, especially not in some truth functional sense, right? But we just dictate that this reduces to usage scenarios. So, for example, right, the meaning of the moral sentence, it's more found in what it does, not really what it says. Like boo abortion generally would just mean, at least most non-cognitivists would just describe it to mean that I disapprove of abortion.
Chill,
expressing
bro.
a commitment.
Wait, am I the only one hearing that from Free Britannia's mic, bro?
What
the fuck is that?
No, I hear it too. I hear it too. I hear it too, bro.
What the fuck is that, bro? What the fuck is that? Yo.
I chill, bro. Damn.
Yo, that's.
It's all like you getting bit down. You just be like,
you hear like, yeah, I hear some juices flowing too, bro. Yo, what is that, bro? What is that?
It's the microphone, bro. It's nothing I can do about it, man. I just came back from like
What is
5 games to 21 of basketball, bro. Like, chill out.
bro?
Oh.
I swear that I'm not even hearing the heavy, not only the heavy breathing, there's like some little like there's like juicing sound in the back, like you're squeezing all the juice out of a lemon.
Oh yeah, I'm
Okay, I'm back.
I'm drinking boba tea, but yeah, if that's what you're referring to, but yeah.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
But yeah, anyways, so yeah, what this would mean in this situation would just be like, hey, I'm expressing this commitment. You should join me in condemning this act. This should not be done, right? And, obviously none of these are truth functional, right, in the usual sense, but they're still pretty meaningful as expressions, right? They still very much show like cheers, commands, vows, and stuff like that. But this still obviously holds a question. What does it explain? I mean, sure, that's what it means, but if we're supposing such a view, we should be motivated towards it. What exactly does it explain? What I personally believe it explains, right, is moral disagreement, right? Non-cognitivism explains this in clashing in attitudes and not or prescriptions rather than beliefs. I believe it explains motivation, right? It expresses an attitude, motivates by its default assumption. Obviously, it explains moral reasoning, right? Non-cognitivism, we usually explain moral reasoning in the sense that it revises and organizes these attitudes and prescriptions. And it provides a consistent line with the morality that ensures one's attitudes are obviously not arbitrary or universal. It just explains moral practice in the terms of attitudes, influencing others, regulating emotion, and creating social coordination. And I think all of these things are what can be explained under non-cognitivism. Now, but there is still a very important question. What exactly, now that we know what exactly non-cognitivism explains, what exactly does cognitivism explain better than that compared to non-cognitivism?
Okay, so I'll answer that question, and I'll explain why what I said before wasn't a burden shift. So, basically, the reason why I asked you that is if you just reduce a statement like abortion is boo abortion to we ought not abort, or you're trying to express an attitude in which it doesn't have to, that statement doesn't have to be true or false. Obviously, you're trying to make an imperative, but when you try to say something like boo abortion, because if what you're trying to say, you said something about moral disagreement, and that's what it explains better. So I'll also engage with that. But if your answer would have been something like, well, when I say boo abortion, I say I disapprove of abortion, and I try to motivate others to not do it. But if that is the case, right, then you are reducing it to a proposition, or you're reducing it to a statement in which they can, like, a cognitivist can say that. A cognitivist can also say
boo abortion what?
If you say boo abortion, right, you are saying something like wait, why did everybody leave? Damn. You're saying something like I disapprove of abortion, right? Or you're saying something like I want you all to not do abortion, or something like that. From what I got from what you said. And in a way, what you said that explains is that this also explains moral disagreement. I heard you say something like that. For the moral disagreement part, I'll engage after this. But how it is relevant for the question that I asked is, if you reduce it down to I disapprove of abortion, or we ought not to do abortion, that is a proposition in which a cognitivist can say that. Cognitivists can also say something like that. It doesn't have to be true or false. Like, obviously, when you're saying boo abortion, you're making imperative. But if you're reducing all of that to a proposition, while also positing these utterances or non-propositional language, while a cognitivist only posits propositions, and they both explain the thing the same way, then it is true that you're just positing unnecessary language. But as far as the moral disagreement part goes that you said, I do absolutely not agree that non-cognitivism explains moral disagreement better. There's a whole argument in more realism which is called the argument from disagreement. Do you know why? Well, because obviously we do disagree on some things, but there is we have such norms, like we have basic moral norms which are so trivial to us, to the point where when somebody doesn't do things which is in alignment with these social norms, they're called psychopaths.
Wait, I
bad
didn't
people,
hear what you were saying.
rapists.
In reference to the moral disagreement.
Okay, so moral disagreement. Okay, I absolutely do not believe that non-cognitivism explains it better. Why? Well, doesn't matter which view you take. Cognitivism, or like any undercognitivism, like subjectivism, more realism. I think they both better explain argument from disagreement, because by the way, there's a whole argument in more realism which is called argument from disagreement. Why? Well, because we obviously disagree on some moral propositions, but some moral propositions are so trivial to us, we literally call them basic norms. And if somebody doesn't do things which are in alignment with basic norms and violate them, then it is just true that we call them bad people, given the way the world is. But why do we do that? If there is such a standard in a way that basically tells us or gives us, the obligation to what we ought to do, right? Then it is just true that more non-cognitivism doesn't explain it better in terms of when it comes to disagreement. I already gave you that Future Tuesday example, like way before when me and you talked. Like, if somebody is like indifference to like their emotion, psychological state completely, right? And then, like for example, they would rather get tortured every single Tuesday to maybe avoid pain on every other day of the week or something like that. Like, you would call that arbitrary, right? But what you would probably call it arbitrary because not because of like a contradiction, but rather because of some standard that we judge things by. And that's because that disagreement that you were referring to under non-cognitivism, when it comes to like these basic moral norms, I think quite literally doesn't exist. Like, obviously we debate on some things like death penalty and abortion. Like, there's a whole thing called applied ethics which deals with that. But when it comes to these basic moral norms, nobody questions that, right? Nobody's like, why is killing wrong? Or killing is trivially to us wrong, or like murder, rather. Sorry, to be specific. You understand what I'm saying?
I mean, yeah. Though I feel like this is a bit. At least your first claim doesn't really address what I'm saying, right? But let's address the question. I mean, if abortion isn't proposition, what does it mean? What does it explain again? Or at least if we're saying I approve or disapprove of abortion, right, is a different kind of claim than abortion is wrong. I mean, if I were to say that I disapprove of abortion, right, obviously, sure, you could say it's some kind of prop. Yeah, I need a proposition, right? But I take this to just simply be a psychological report, right? It's just a factual statement about the speaker's mental state. That's not what most people are doing when they say abortion is wrong. They're not reporting on themselves. Often they're not even aware of their own approval or disapproval, at least in those terms, right? And when we're engaging in normative discourse, we're just trying to influence or express how things should be, not how they are. So even if these two utterances correlate in practice, they play different roles regardless, okay? So to say I disapprove of abortion is a fact about someone. This is more cognitively and psychologically related. But to say abortion is wrong, this is simply a normative stance that can be expressed non-cognitively. So that already provides a good foundation and overflow, right? But why does non-cognitivism explain why moral claims are motivational? Well, a big motivation for non-cognitivism, obviously, I don't know if you're aware of moral internalism, but this is just the idea that sincere moral judgments are inherently motivating. I mean, so if moral judgments were just simply beliefs, as in cognitivism, we'd have to explain why beliefs about moral facts necessarily motivate, which they usually don't, right? You can believe smoking is bad and still smoke. But if moral judgments are attitudes or prescriptions, the motivation is simply built in, right? So a non-cognitivist avoids having to add a second psychological state, otherwise known as a belief plus desire, to explain this motivation, right? Thus, we're not really adding variables or adding extra claims or explanations, as you've posited, from being less parsimonious, but it's really just removing the need to posit these moral facts, and it's bridging this belief motivation gap directly. But also, this raises another thing. Moral disagreement, right, is deeper than disagreements about attitudes. you're right. Like both non-cognitivists and cognitivists can explain moral disagreement. I don't disagree with this, right? But non-cognitivists argue that moral disagreement isn't just about which attitudes we hold, right? It's about trying to shape and align each other's attitudes, right? It's more like disagreement over norms and facts, right? A cognitivist has to commit themselves to saying moral disagreement is simply just about truth tracking, right? And obviously, this would raise a metaphysical burden, which in fact adds extra compared to norm or non-cognitivism. We'd have to ask, what are moral facts? I mean, once we establish that, we'd have to ask, how do we access them? And then once we establish that, now we have to understand why do they even motivate us? And it just seems to posit a lot more issues than the latter, right? Now, obviously, I feel like the overall tone of what we're getting down to is, are non-cognitivists just sneaking in propositions under a new name, right? Obviously, the Friedrich-Geach problem. But, you know, and generally, let's just ask, how can non-truth apt expressions, such as, let's say, boo-abortion, function in logical arguments if they don't behave like propositions? But what I say to that is this. Modern non-cognitivists usually would admit that they need a more complex account of how moral language works in embedded context. You know, conditionals, debates, logic. This is a very important question. So yes, their theories become more complex, but we still argue that this is less metaphysically burdensome than cognitivism, because we're simply just explaining how moral language works without positing this mysterious moral truth. Now, you made another point after you brought up the initial one. You made the statement that, from what I can understand, that non-cognitivism doesn't explain moral disagreement better, and that they both explain what's called the argument for, or that you know, one posits or has an argument from disagreement, and that we disagree on some props. So obviously some props are so agreed upon, mainly because they seem to be trivial or seem to correspond with our natural intuitions. The Future Tuesday example I believe you gave, because we had that convo a while ago as well. But what a non-cognitivist would usually respond with is this. Yes, both views explain disagreement, but we explain the motivation and normativity at the same time, which is something cognitivism does not do, right? Non-cognitivists agree that both beliefs can explain disagreement, right? Obviously, a cognitivist would say that we disagree about the truth of propositions, i.e., you know, abortion is wrong, is true versus false. And a non-cognitivist would say that we disagree in attitudes, you know, prescriptions or plans of action. But, you know, what they claim is that, you know, their model explains why moral disagreement feels like a clash of values, not just beliefs, right? It's because a clash of non-cognitivist, or it's because it is, you know, a clash of non-cognitivist states that motivate action, right? So just in other words, in a more simplistic version of that, right? We disagreement in moral discourse. It's not just about what is the case, right? It's about what should be done and what we should care about. So even if the realist can describe the moral disagreement in propositional terms, non-cognitivists claim they do a better job of explaining the motivational force as well, of just the propositional terms, the practical nature of moral discourse, and even why disagreement persists despite shared facts. Right? Moral disagreements can be deep without facts. Non-cognitivists also appeal to examples where factual agreement doesn't resolve moral disagreement as well. We all agree on the facts of abortion, and yet we still disagree on its permissibility. We agree on the consequence of a capital punishment, for example, but we still disagree on its justice, right? What this non-cog would argue is that this shows moral disagreement isn't just about facts, but it's about how we respond to them, what norms we apply, and also what commitments we endorse. Right. So in that sense, we're just saying that disagreement is more naturally modeled as clashing prescriptions rather than just as conflicting factual beliefs. Now I will address this counter side. It is understandable that realism handles this too, but I feel as though what's it called? Cognitivism needs extra assumptions as far as motivation, and it doesn't handle normativity on such a level as well. So that's really what we're saying here.
Okay, so there are a few things there. I don't think I tracked all of that. I do think I tracked the main points though. So number one was the nature of the attitude of a said thing can be still disagreed upon, right? I mean, that's something obviously, like the reasons for why you would say boo killing or something like that. That's something obviously can be disagreed upon in a way where somebody will genuinely justify it to the point of like where you would question your normativity from the start, but somebody would say, well, it hurts. That's why I think we should like get rid of it. Like obviously somebody can have a different explanation for this, but their explanation will either be fundamentally the same in a way where like maybe it's even true that everybody just expresses an attitude. Hypothetically, let's just say that is the case. That's still a form of reason in which you could say it's even an external reason, the one which non-naturalists are dealing with. Like humanist conscious view that I gave you, I think like a long time ago. It is like the view in which, like, let's just say during 1945, Truman, who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima during 1945, right? He feels pleasure, but the pilot who actually dropped it feels guilty and feels like this conscious that is eating him up alive. But why is that the case, right? So maybe that is something which I would also grant being like, if that's the type of thing which gives us this standard, then I'm completely fine with saying that that type of reason would also be something which is stands independent in that way, or leads to something which stands independent at the very least. Two, I think you call it the Friedrich Giesch problem. I can never pronounce it good in English, but basically, that's something that I was about to bring up. If they act as propositions, right? If that's how I understood it from before. If they act as propositions, and even I think you granted. I'm not. I'll say maybe you granted it because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe they can even be reduced to a proposition. You put. I think you put it in a hypothetical. Well, in a hypothetical, when you grant that, right, that you can reduce them to a proposition, then again, if the only argument to why you need these propositions, this non-propositional language is because of these like moral disagreement and expressing of the psychological state, I'll engage with that. But if that is and if I refute that, if that's still the only reason, then I still wouldn't see why it would be not just struck down by parsimony. But to engage with the psychological state, and I think you still went on with moral disagreement. I'm completely fine with granting that some people will say that these things express psychological states. But I can say rather in a way, a naturalist, realist, or even a subjectivist. A subjectivist can be non-cognitive. Doesn't have to be a non-cognitivist. Can be like a cognitivist. That is trivially true to them. Like if they say something like, moral, like something like killing is wrong, and they're reducing it down to something like, well, it's because of some form of suffering. And then they say, and then you ask them, wait, but why is suffering the type of thing which makes it wrong, right? Why? What's the point of the suffering? And then it suddenly gets to them. There is a meaning, right? Which is this avoidance of suffering, of this fundamental qualia. It doesn't matter whether it's emotional suffering or like physical suffering. This like, if you want to call it non-physical or physical suffering, doesn't matter how you want to cash it out. It is just true that this reason to everybody, if it is qualia, it's gonna be that type of thing is gonna be something which essentially will kind of give them this moral judgment. Now, if that is true, and that's still a standard that you judge by, it doesn't matter if it's like, if you view that qualia, that fundamental qualia as attitudes, right, to what we act in correspondence with, you would also agree that because of our attitudes, if somebody doesn't have the same attitude toward killing or like murdering or raping, right, they are probably bad people. But why make this standard if all you're reducing it down to is an attitude, right? And that's something you're getting on when it comes to the moral disagreement part. Moral disagreement, again, I don't think it is something which, although you did explain it in a way, I don't think like when we are referring to moral disagreement, I don't think that something cannot be explained under these views, but just in a way where if you say something like, okay, we're expressing disagreement in attitudes. We do it all the time. You can even make an induction. I'll even grant you that. You can make an induction that we disagree on attitudes all the time. So why wouldn't it be the case here? We obviously disagree on moral propositions. So what if there are some moral propositions, right, which are to us like basic norms? What does that get me? Maybe we just like came to some agreement. We also do that every single time, right? But there's something more fundamental than that. Like you wouldn't make a universal agreement about something being wrong or something being good. Make the universal agreement just because you had an attitude, right? That doesn't matter if it's like that's like saying the same as saying that there can be a reason to why eating pizza is better than eating burgers, or I like chocolate ice cream is better than like vanilla ice cream, right? If that is the case, then there is also going to be some attitudes which can make this universally the case. So that there's something way more fundamental than just attitudes when it comes to killing and murdering and these basic moral norms, right? And one more thing, I agree with eternalism. I genuinely do believe the moral statements are supposed to be motivating, so that's why they're like normative statements. But when it comes to the thing you said about also truth makers, and there's like when there are disagreements on like the truth value of it, right? Then that something doesn't have to be the case at all. There's like a whole view of realism, I don't know if you're familiar with it, called relaxed realism, which say that they're probably true, but they're all true or false, stands independently, but there's not a truth maker for them, right? So they can still like talk about their truth value, but this truth value talk is going to be way more different than what you think it is, because they don't have this truth maker to discuss upon. So there is not even an attitude, right, about this thing. When it comes to like relaxed realism, that like completely negates the non-cognitivism in a way where like they're in reference to attitudes. Like that's like a complete shutdown for non-cognitivism when it comes to relaxed realism, right? And if that is all that was like non-cognitivism explains better, I just then don't understand, if that is the case, and if you agree with what I said so far, why should I posit such entity like non-propositional language, like these imperatives, if they don't explain anything better? Like if I have an imperative which is like, give me the water now, although I can reduce that to a proposition, that attitude clearly expresses something which is like necessary in that scenario. I just don't see that the same for morality, right?
Well, I mean, to address what we're dealing with here, let's unpack a few things. So first, it seems that we're raising a few points about the meaningfulness of attitudes as reasons, the possibility of rational disagreement about normative attitudes, the variability of moral emotion and attitudes, and whether this variability undermines the authority or grounding of moral norms. Now, attitudes can be disagreed about and do have reasons, right? You're arguing that even if moral utterances express attitudes, we can still give reasons for them, right? It's not like they're empty and irrational. At least that it seems that you're addressing with, at least it seems that's what the variability issue addresses. And I mean, you're right? This isn't necessarily a contention against cognitivism. Most modern expressivists would literally say that attitudes can be revised, criticized, abandoned, using reasons, reflections, and moral deliberation. So like, yeah, even if I say that boo killing, right, that doesn't end the conversation. You can still respond with, well, okay, what if I'm defending myself? Or what if killing this person avoids worse harm? Then in that instance, you would just reevaluate your attitude in light of new considerations. This is where normative reasoning happens in non-cognitivism, right? It's not just reasoning about facts, but about what to feel, prescribe, and what to commit to. So even attitudes, though they're non-propositional, can still have reasons behind them, grounded in human values, shared practices, and psychological reflection. But obviously, are these reasons, or are they just rationalizations? What would even be the difference between those two? Well, it seems that your example kind of, I don't know, posited around like a man who hires a bomber and they feel pleasure and the bomber feels grief. If these moral claims are just attitudes, whose feelings count? What norm really governs in this instance? And I mean, I've heard this very, very often, right? But obviously, in response to this, I probably would just say that the man's pleasure at bombing is not just different feeling, um, but but seemingly what's it called? These expressions and these attitudes can be held base basically based off of these reflections that have gone upon like in the past, right? We can have and we can explain these reflections and these attitudes and these differences in attitudes using psychological evaluation and using normal normative reasoning tactics that don't just have to prescribe to facts. So this variability again, like this isn't usually anything that that would affect a non-cognitivism, right? Like a non-cognitivism literally would just say that variation is a feature, right? It's not some thing that has an issue with it. I mean, moral discourse is just how we negotiate these norms across different psychologies, right? We were just creating in this instance, we would just this variability would be explained by the fact that we create these practical consensuses, right? It's not some grand moral discovery we're making. um Grief versus pleasure obviously is morally relevant, but that's just because we decide to care about harm, suffering, and humanity, right? There's no fact that grief is just better than pleasure, right? But there is a shared human tendency to care about suffering, which seems to ground it, which can be explained without having to use moral factives. Now, to address what seems to be the next issue, it seems that you just revisited the freak Geach argument. That's what I pronounce it as. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. And yeah, this is understandable. I mean, I hear this quite often when people are going against non-cognitivism. Um, it is one of the most serious and kind of hard out objections. But from what I'm understanding, all this problem really states is just that non-cogs, obviously, or at least non-cognitivism, it seems to report why simple moral sentences like murder is wrong, express attitudes, um, but not truth out propositions. But we seem to run into a few issues, at least on the opposing perspective, right? I mean, let's say if we have P1 abortion is wrong, um, then getting your I don't know your little sister an abortion is wrong. Let's say abortion is wrong, therefore getting your little sister an abortion is wrong, right? In this kind of argument, we're using abortion is wrong not to just express disapproval, but we're contributing to some form of logicality that's valid to the argument. I mean, if abortion is wrong has no truth value, how does this logic work? You can't apply truth functionality to things such as boo abortion or boo murder, because that's just a speech act, is what they usually refer to it as, not a prop. But this could be dealt with and reconciled in many easy ways. First off, we have to distinguish what use and what mention actually mean. What is the difference between expression and what's pronounced embedding, right? Expression or expressing a moral attitude, such as saying boo abortion, versus referring to or embedding a moral claim in a much more complex structure. For example, if abortion is wrong, then this. That's the main difference. Okay, and a non-cognitivist would say in the latter, right, in this embedded context, we're not expressing attitudes directly. We're just referring to the kinds of attitudes that we would take if certain conditions were held, right? So in the conditional, if abortion is wrong, then getting your little sister an abortion is wrong. We are expressing really just a higher order attitude, right? It's just a disposition to disapprove of facts that logically follow from other disapproved facts, right? So this means that we can preserve logical consistency between attitudes. We can still recognize these patterns of inferential commitment, while at the same time saying that these embed moral claims don't really we don't need to treat them as truth apt, right? Um, Also, I don't know if you are aware of Gibbard's expressivism, but this really just talks about projecting and planning attitudes. So in this expressivism, right, we're simply just saying that moral language, it's going to be more so reset to simply just expressing plans, normative ideas, and commitments rather than feelings or standalone commands. So, for example, if we say that abortion is wrong, okay, that this expresses a plan to not abort under any normal conditions, then we would say if abortion is wrong, then getting your sister is abortion is wrong. This simply just expresses a second order plan, which would just say that if I disapprove of abortion, I simply also disapprove of encouraging others to do it, right? But this lets us set this logical structure that the what's called problem arises. It allows us to explain this logical structure simply as just relationships amongst, plans or normativities. We don't need to have any propositions within any truth functional sense in this instance. And this helps us because it gives us a framework where logical validity is not necessarily about truth preservation, which is what the cognitivists would attack, right? But it's just about normal or norm consistency, right? This not only saves modus ponens and other logical forms, but it gives us a reconciliation towards this. Now we can go over quasi-realism, logical consistency, but I've spoken for so long. I'm gonna leave those for the future if we need to go over those. The final point you mentioned was you brought up relaxed realism. Now I personally believe non-cognitivism explains a lot better than relaxed realism, which I think it seems that this is the question that's arising. I think, all I take relaxed realism to be is just that moral claims are truth-apt and often true. Right? There are moral facts, but they don't require robust metaphysical grounding. Right? We don't need spooky properties or invisible properties, and that these moral facts are mind independent, but their existence isn't mysterious or metaphysically outweighing. Right? They may supervene on natural and normative facts that we just already accept. Right? That's the part of relaxed in it. Right? It just tries to combine realism commitments to non-mystical metaphysics. But there is a few issues that runs into as well. Or more so, there's a few things that are explained better in non-cognitivism compared to. Well, first off, internalism, which is something I mentioned a little bit earlier. All right, non-cognitivism seems to explain the link between moral judgment and motivation better than relaxed realism, especially under an internalist view, right? If I sincerely say that lying is wrong and I don't feel at all motivated to avoid lying, right? It seems something's off. But non-cognitivists would say that this is because moral judgments just are expressions of attitudes or commitments that are intrinsically motivating, right? So by contrast, this relaxed realist must commit itself to saying lying is wrong is a belief about moral fact, and that motivation comes from a separate desire. This just leads to externalism about motivation, which obviously could arise issues in psychological implausibility, right? Because how do we get to psychological commitments then? Also, just non-cognitivism really just solves moral disagreement without metaphysical baggage. Non-cognitivism literally explains why moral disagreements feel so deep and persistent without positing metaphysically weird moral facts. We disagree not over facts, but over attitudes and norms we commit to. And these don't require any entities. Now, relaxed realism also wants to explain moral disagreement this way, but there's a catch to it. Relaxed realists usually say that there is a truth to be discovered, and that some people are right and others are wrong. So even though it's relaxed, it's still realism, right? And this obviously leads to the pressure to explain what makes moral claims true. Even if the truth is relaxed, it still needs some grounding, right? And this obviously can feel very circular and get into very circular metaphysics, which non-cognitivism avoids. So it seems that relaxed realism isn't necessarily just the better idea overall. But also just from the fact that it claims that we need metaphysical bridging principles. Relaxed realism still needs to answer what are moral truths, what kind of entities or relations make them true, how do they relate to natural facts, how do we even come to know them, right? The same issues that I brought up earlier, right? In these relaxed accounts, they still invoke epistemology of value, right? Which is extremely circular, or not, that's biased, but I'm going to say it can be extremely circular, right? Because we know moral truths or what's it called? Because in this instance, they typically say that we know moral truths by reasoning about what's reasonable, but they wouldn't even be able to answer the question of what moral reasoning is without diving into even more commitments. So it seems that, at least by the initial intention or contention you gave, this is far less parsimonious than non-cognitivism. So that concludes my response here. But
yeah, there's some things I wrote down. So it doesn't mean that I didn't really track them. There's something that I really want to get a pain. You said pain being better than happiness is not a fact, but rather something which is in correspondence to human tendencies. And non-cognitivists can explain moral disagreement without using some metaphysical commitment called moral facts. And then the third thing, which is that relaxed realism would posit way more things if they posit these moral truths. And it's given my contention, that form of realism or any form of realism in general is just going to be way less parsimonious than non-cognitivism. So the first thing about pain being better than happiness being a human tendency rather than a fact. Hypothetically, if I agree with this, right, let's just say it's just a human tendency. Doesn't matter. If this human tendency is the way that we come to some form of moral conclusion or moral judgments, like why should the person shouldn't be tortured because, like, obviously you don't want them to feel this suffering. But if this some human tendency is so universally agreed upon in a way where people usually run to that as a reason to why you shouldn't do a certain action, it's so universally agreed upon to the point where people just avoid suffering, given the inductive case for almost everything, right? Like, people would do such a thing in where if it meant that people, for example, I don't know, some people would way rather, but some people, I'll explain why it's relevant. Some people would way rather, who are smart, work on, for example, being a lawyer than them lifting and them like, sorry, not even lifting, but them being like a boxer or something. Yeah, some let's just say a smart person, like a lawyer or something. He's probably gonna choose to be a lawyer rather than to be some like professional fighter. Not because he would like not because he's doing anything immoral if he's gonna be a boxer, but he wants to avoid suffering generally in a way. It doesn't have to be his reason to be a lawyer doesn't have to be because he's smart, but rather because he just doesn't want to go through the pain, right, of being a boxer or being like a professional fighter, but not because it's immoral, obviously, but just he wants to avoid suffering. And you can make an inductive case for generally these things, given the way the world is, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is, if this fundamental quality of pain being better than happiness is just a human tendency, and I hypothetically agree with that, then you have to answer this question: why? Where's going to be a distinction then in that type of fundamental qualia explaining some certain action being wrong and our sensory experience, right, explaining to us why moon would exist or grass being green? And that is going to be a problem, because both sensory experience and qualia, such as like happiness, pain, and our emotional psychological states, all of that generally is just something which I think was developed the same way during that form of evolution that we went through our years. Like, I think that the thing that made us breathe and the thing that made us see, I think that same thing gave us this qualia of suffering and happiness. And you can say that that's a very weird claim to make and something that I would really have to justify. But I really think if you want to go into that, we can go into that further. But I think mostly agree to that even our attitudes would lead to that said thing. Doesn't matter if you're a deontologist, whatever you are, some form of pain and suffering, there's gonna be like something which would make you avoid it. But that doesn't have to be because there's like this logical standard, but rather there's like some synthetic standard or like some standard given the way the world is that makes this thing being true. So if it's just a human tendency rather than a fact, what makes that distinct from your sensory experience when you're trying to make a certain claim? So that's one. And the two, that the second claim that I wanted to address was pain being better. You said something about giving the second. Oh, no, not that. Yeah, non-cognitives can explain moral disagreement without using this metaphysical commitment called moral facts. Although I'm not specifically arguing from the point of realism, if you want me to take that position, that is completely fine. I was just arguing from broad cognitivism. But if you want to say, let's just say, like a relaxed realist still has to hold to this moral fact, and then you will say, well, why holding to these truths and why hold to them being stance independent what does that then explain better? And if it doesn't, then your own contention is just like completely irrelevant, right? Because you tried to say, you would probably say something like, you tried to say Frey that it is less parsimonious, right? But then there's the thing that I want to ask you, which is, if you do agree that moral facts, right, completely explain this fine, and completely fine the same way you think non-cognitive is, or even doesn't have to be like that, right? Let's just say that it's not like that. Let's just say that it's not really gonna be a contention of like parsimony. Let's just say that there is a contention of explanatory power, right? It's not strong. Then I want to ask you, still, in what way do you explain things better, right? Because again, I'm not arguing from a realist perspective. If I was, then that would be a way different story. Because then I would probably wouldn't just hold to parsimony in general. I'll hold to something else. I'm holding from like a broad cognitivism. So it's just about propositions, right? So what do you explain better than when we look at from what you said so far when it comes to realism and non-cognitivism? Because what it seems to me is, I think that even these objective moral facts kind of do explain an obligation way better, and it's in effect I do hold to being necessary for them to exist to explain this moral obligation, right? If no laws were to exist, though, I think that majority of people, like a very big majority, still wouldn't go randomly in a street and rape a woman, right? But why is that the case? Like, it's you can definitely say that it's because of an attitude, right? But if this attitude again is so universal, I just want to make a claim that there's going to be such a strong attitude that everybody's going to hold to. And that's where I think you still lack explanatory power in comparison to a realist. But again, I'm arguing from a broad cognitivism, so it's not really into that. Third thing, you said something which I definitely, and I think there was 99% chance that I wrote it wrong. But given the circumstance, non-cognitivists can express attitudes that are of the value to the claim. You didn't say it like that, but I think I interpreted it that way. But it's something that given the circumstance, there's not going to be a correct. You didn't say correct, but it was, which is like there's going to be an attitude which can like I think overweigh the other in a way. Like when you made the abortion example with like the I probably wouldn't. If I think boo abortion, then it would be also boo abortion for my daughter or something. In that claim, right? When you make that claim, I just think that, again, I obviously agree that there are some attitudes, and even inductively, you can make an induction that we always disagree upon attitudes, and you can also say that the moral non-cognition can explain moral disagreement, right? Also, in that way, that's how you can determine whether one overweighs the other in that sense, if you understand what I'm saying. But that still doesn't explain. You also said, I think you said that that there's not really something against cognitivism in that way, but I think you said that you're completely fine with also like that. Not that it explains better, but it also explains fine in a way that's cognitivist, no matter whether it's subjectivist or a realist, that they both explain pretty fine when it comes to moral disagreement. And again, just to refresh on something that I said before, because I want to make a point about that, there's a whole argument in realism, which is called the argument from disagreement. And again, the reason why I'm repeating that is because in a way where you say something like a basic norm, right? You say that there's like a disagreement about psychological states, attitudes, and blah, 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 right? But that doesn't seem to be the case for these universal norms, right? That doesn't seem to be the case. Doesn't matter whether you think, right, that there is still something to be disagreed upon. The set claim, killing is wrong, in a sense of like boo killing. Doesn't matter how you interpret it. Let's just like forget propositional language. The statement about you ought not to kill, or we ought not kill, or do not kill specifically in that sense, right? That's something I think, again, is way more fundamental than just an attitude. Like it cannot be something like obviously we can come to conclusions about attitudes like eating pizza is way better than eating shit. Like even though like there's some attitudes like that we can all universally converge upon. If you want to make a claim that eating pizza is better than eating shit is the same as boo killing or like boo abortion, then I would really want to know why those, I think they're called gnostic facts or something like that, why those type of facts would be the same as moral statements, or hypothetically if you were to grant them moral facts. And there's also something I want to get a touch on.
Wait, for a second, you said if you make a claim
Yeah,
like
some-
pizza is better than eating shit, and then I didn't hear the rest. What was that?
Yeah, if you want to say like Rizan, bro, you taking a shit on mic, bro? What the fuck? So,
Oh, don't worry, I put a muzzle on him. Good.
no, chill, don't be man. But yeah, when it comes to moral facts, if you were to say like hypothetically that they exist, but or like not even they exist, but these moral propositions, we can come to like an agreement. The same way we would come to agreement of like an attitude, like eating pizza is better than eating shit. Those are, I think, called gnostic facts. So if you want to make a claim that moral propositions, when it comes to attitudes, are the same as those type of practices, like gnostic facts, I would really want to see not even an argument, but really just a form of explanation for that. But there was something I also wanted to touch on. Yeah, the problem, and you said something about that. Then about like that. When it comes to when it comes to the Friedrich Giesch problem, I think we called it. Again, I don't even disagree that there is some propositional language that you can derive from like a moral proposition, right? Like killing is wrong, and then you derive it to you must not kill or don't kill or something like that. I think you can make that language, but in a way that we've gone so far, I don't see what it explains better. I'm still not in that sense motivated to say, okay, it expresses an attitude. Okay, why does that matter? Well, through our attitudes, I think that's something that's like the fundamental basis to our moral judgments. And if I give you a counter example to that, then I don't really think that there's something that it explains better. I think you're just pausing in an unnecessary language, and it would be just better to hold to propositions at that point, right? But you said something about, to also engage with the relaxed realism point even further. If I'm just positing a stance-independent moral proposition, stance-independent reason for moral propositions in that way, in which it makes them true, there's some saying in which stance-independent reasons make true, that I think is rather necessary for the thing like moral propositions. I think that said entity is rather necessary than being some random explanation that I posit. In a way where, like, I think for moral obligation to exist, some motivator in when it comes to us should exist that is so fundamental to the point where we would universally agree upon that, right? So I think that is like also something that can be made as a counterexample to non-cognitive. Okay, if these things are true, doesn't matter what you think that's an attitude, doesn't matter what you think it is. If it is true, there is some reason, doesn't matter what you think is avoidance of suffering, like some humanist conscious view or some other non-external reason that made us fundamentally agree on what a moral proposition is tried to portray, like what is the meaning of it, then I don't really think that that's something which is an attitude. I really do think that it's something way deeper still. So yeah, sorry for the long explanation. Trying to shorten it up as much as I can, but there are too many points, so maybe we can shorten it out however you want, but yeah.
Okay, moral judgments reflect evolved psychological dispositions, right? Non-cognitivists, especially expressivists, argue that when we make moral claims like suffering is bad or he ought not to cause pain, we are not reporting truths. We're simply expressing deeply ingrained dispositions, emotions, and norm-guided commitments that emerged evolutionarily. So when we say pain is bad, not because we've discovered a moral fact, but we're saying it because we've evolved to disapprove of it, to avoid of it, and to warn others, and to organize social norms around minimizing it. Non-cognitivism makes this central. Moral utterances function like emotional signaling. Okay, you can think of this as just prescriptive communication, not factual description. Okay, shared qualia is not the same as shared truths. You're right in the fact that pain is worse than happiness isn't a fact. It's just a patterned response to qualia rooted in our biology, right? And I mean, we love this point. We love this point mainly because just because everyone agrees pain is bad doesn't mean it's objectively bad, right? Like in the same light, it feels like you're arguing more for my position, at least for that point, than yours. It simply means that we've evolved a shared normative response, a cluster of disapprovals, aversions, and empathetic triggers, and just simply planning dispositions. Right? You can compare this. This is, I believe, the what you asked me to give the distinction between. The moon exists, right? This is a belief about an external object, but pain is bad is a commitment, reaction, or stance toward internal experience. It's not a belief about a moral property. So non-cognitivist, this is the main key distinction we draw. Descriptive beliefs track external facts, such as physics, biology, anatomy, yada, yada. But these moral judgments simply reflect how we are disposed to feel or react, right? No moral fact is needed to explain this, which is what we're positing. As far as your point about parsimony, that there's no need to posit, what's it called, such things. I mean, you're correct in the idea that, at least you correctly pointed out that, what's it called, moral realism posits, what's it called, these truths, and that this means more ontological assumptions, right? But and in the sense of relaxed realism, right? These truths are relaxed. They're suddenly, mind independent in some thin sense. But this still doesn't seem to explain what makes them true, why we should care about them, or what we really know about them. The whole point of a parsimony, at least with non-cognitivism, which was your initial point to begin with, was simply to explain that moral discourse can be explained entirely in terms of evolved dispositions, attitudes, language practices, and normative coordination. Right? There's no metaphysical layer that's added. So, it seems that this holds on to, at least relaxed realism holds on to more commitments. Now, obviously, you're just taking the view of, broad cognitivism. I'm just attacking specific views that you brought up, right? We still have to just the view of cognitivism. We've tossed one out the way, not the other, right? You gave an analogy between a lawyer versus a fighter, right? Your example was that a person avoids being a fighter, not because of morality, but because he wants to avoid suffering. Perfect, right? What a non-cognitivist would simply say is that the choice expresses a motivational attitude, right? A plan or preference, not a truth. If he later says fighting is wrong, that's simply a way of expressing or communicating his plan or disapproval. He's not reporting a fact, right? The normative dimension of that statement comes from the idea that, the shared, at least comes from the idea of generally what I would think, shared social practices, emotional aversion, desires to shape others' behaviors, and simply commitments to norms that reduce harm. So again, I just explained that without using truth, right? Simply just attitude and expression. And this seems to explain it on a level where non-cognitivism isn't being compromised. We've seemed to reconcile this issue, right? But why is this a defense for non-cognitivism? Well, what this highlights and what this mainly notes, because I know that was a bit of a long-winded speech, that morality is deeply human, okay, evolved, and simply responsive to qualia. Now, that fact does not require any metaphysical truths, okay? And we can preserve everything we care about in moral practice, which is, I'd assume you would agree, disagreement, normativity, moral language, moral reasoning, by explaining it in terms of attitudes and shared practices. And what we get when we do that is a more parsimonious theory, a better fit theory with evolutionary psychology and cognitive science, which you brought up, and a lot less metaphysical mystery. So, now you made another point. That was just your initial response, right? Your second response seemed to aim to say that if relaxed realists posit moral facts, what's it called? Or I guess you're asking, why does non-cognitivism really outperform cognitivism, right? Including relaxed realism. At least in the ways I think it explains it better. First we need to understand what exactly a relaxed realist or a cognitivism supposes it explains better. Usually, what I assume is, a relaxed realist or a cognitivist would argue, or explain why moral statements can be true or false, why we have correct and incorrect moral beliefs, which is a silly idea to me, why genuine disagreement arises, not just from conflicting attitudes, but obviously you believe that these are conflicting beliefs about morality. Obviously, moral knowledge. You guys seem to think you can answer the question of how we come to know moral truths and normativity. Why moral claims actually bind us in some weird and special way. Well, non-cognitivism explains so and said better in the sense to where moral motivation, at least within such a view, is intrinsic to judgments, right? Non-cognitivism explains why moral judgment naturally motivates agents, okay? This is internalism. So this view seems to explain where this motivation actually comes from and why these judgments motivate us. If you're a cognitivist, you have to add extra assumptions known as desires to explain this motivation. And this seems to posit more entities than the latter, right? Which seems to be your whole branch of contention. At least that's what you started with. Moral language functions in everyday use in the sense of non-cognitivism far better than cognitivism beliefs, mainly because it better accounts for expensive and prescriptive nature of moral discourse. For example, the example you gave earlier, boo murder, right? Cognitivism struggles with why moral claims often do more than state facts. This doesn't seem something that can be at least accounted for or reconciled within cognitivism without having to break one of your main commitments. Which just takes us to our next point, parsimony, right? Avoiding, obviously, all this metaphysical luggage, right? Non-cognitivism doesn't multiply entities by positing mind-independent moral facts, right? This view is far better in the sense to where it fits better with naturalistic worldviews and evolutionary psychology, as I explained earlier, which I'm not going to yap about again. But yeah, these disagreements reflect conflicting attitudes, not disagreements over objective truths. And seemingly it fits better with our observed psychological realities, which is a benefit to non-cognitivism that doesn't seem to benefit cognitivism in the same sense, right? But what exactly do moral facts, or what moral facts could explain better if they do, right? This is something that we should probably answer. Obviously, if moral facts were to exist, maybe they would argue, or maybe you would argue, that the apparent objectivity or stability of moral claims, across cultures would be reconciled. You probably would say that, if some moral claims aren't truth apt, how can we say someone is morally wrong? All these things. But I think non-cognitivism reconciles what's it called this in many different ways, because it explains internal linkage without extra assumptions. This moral language, as attitude expressives, seem to be more coordinate, especially with sociality. It has far fewer ontological commitments compared to cognitivism. Attitudes conflicting doesn't require a mystery about truth. Meanwhile, in cognitivism, that doesn't seem to be the case. I obviously mentioned quasi-realism earlier, so yeah, it obviously could explain through attitudes and coherence, but we can talk about that afterwards if you disagree with that. That one is kind of just, again, hinging off of what I mentioned earlier. But yeah, I mean, there's many things that explains better, but there does seem to be a confusion that arises though. You stated that, for some reason we're committing ourselves to universal norms. And this right here, I guess I don't entirely understand what you mean when you say this. I mean, non-cognitivism, it does not have to mean pure subjectivism or relativism, right? We can understand universal norms as simply shared, convergent, and ideally rational attitudes, right? So, for example, when a moral community converges on the idea that murder is wrong, that norm is universal within that community, right? And can be extended as a rational ideal to others. The norm is not a fact out there in the world in the sense to where this is applied unconditionally and it isn't proportional to communities, right? But it's merely a social practice and a normative commitment that applies broadly, right? Because it is endorsed and prescriptively accepted by all rational agents. So that's an idea to really lock into. You know, it's not the fact that we think that we're universalist, right? That's just not the case. Obviously, you know, normativity has practical reasons as well. Many non-cogs simply would just also respond to this by saying that agents who are rational and reflective come to endorse certain norms because they support coherent, consistent, and cooperative living, right? Universal norms arise as the outcome of idealized rational deliberation, not as the outcome of metaphysical facts. So we avoid the commitment of having to link to inconsistent traits and attitudes. And it seems to reconcile these inconsistent traits and attitudes by explaining the rational agents. But you also said this, you know, I think the last point you mentioned was that you don't disagree that there is a non-prop language you can derive from this. But in what way? But in a way, at least in the way we've gone so far, what actually does this explain better than cognitivism? Especially because the fact that I guess to you, I've only addressed realism and not cognitivism as well. Now, obviously, I touched on cognitivism beforehand as well, but we'll also give this. I already mentioned the more parsimonious point, but I haven't mentioned this point yet. More non-cognitivism, it seems to capture the expressive and prescriptive functions of moral language in a better way than cognitivism does. I mean, moral talk often does more than just state facts. It expresses feelings, it expresses issue commands, and it tries to influence behavior. And non-cognitivism directly models this expressive and prescriptive functionality of moral language. Meanwhile, cognitivism struggles to explain why moral language is so tied up with expressing attitudes and motivating action, if this is quote unquote the truth. Now you also mentioned along with that if you know you're just positing a stance independent reasons in that way, it's rather necessary than being, or that this seems to be more necessary than a random explanation that I could posit. I didn't really understand this response much, honestly. I don't think you entirely explained it, but at least from what I think you're saying, or at least hopefully this responds. It seems that non-cognitivism doesn't randomly posit stance-independent reasons. I mean, non-cognitivism is built on explaining moral language and practice from the ground up, right? These things are not ad hoc or arbitrary. I mean, these things start with attitudes, social interactions, and motivation, right? If it incorporates stance-independent reasons, it does so to account for the best interpretation of moral discourse and practice, right? Not randomly. It derives these reasons from patterns in normative reasoning, not just it doesn't just pluck them out of thin air, right? They're necessary for explaining why we engage in moral reason at all. It's why we revise attitudes and why we expect other people to, right? This appeal to stance-independent reasons, it's really just a theoretical tool. It's not some extra positive entity, right? In many cognitivist frameworks, or non-cognitivist frameworks, I should specify, I'm sorry, like quasi-realism and constructivism, I mean, stance-independent reasons are merely just normative standards that arise from reflective, you know, agreements rather than these metaphysical facts. I mean, they help, yes, make sense of normativity, but they do so without reifying, you know, these moral facts. I mean, we don't have to hold on to these in order to make sense of normativity. So yeah, I hope that responds to you, but.
Okay, I'll try to shorten my response as much as I can so we can wrap it up, because for me it's almost like 11 p.m. And I'll probably should try to sleep earlier, you know, try to get that sleep, you know. But listen, there are some things I want to get a touch on. Just because it is universally agreed upon doesn't mean that it is a fact. I think that's one of the claims you made, like, from the start. That is true. Obviously, it is true. If somebody was to converge upon I don't think that converging upon something is automatically going to make it a fact, right? You can convert. There is like a convergence that eating pizza is better than eating shit. That is a convergence, but it's not a fact, obviously. Now, again, when you look at prior probability, right? If there is convergence upon something, I do believe, at first glance, obviously, if you present more think that's going to be the case. But on first glance, when you look at two hypotheses, and they're both equal in some way, but one is completely converged upon, right? I think it will rise the prior probability of something being true. But I obviously do not think that it's going to be true, definitely, because we converged upon it. I think that is absurd. But yeah, it's the thing that I was specifically questioning is if it's just an attitude, right? I know you tried to engage with it, and I do think it was a good response. I just do still believe that there are some problems, mainly because obviously it is a non-cognitivist response. But I do believe that you engage with the point, like, how does an attitude lead to something being so universally agreed upon? But I think that that's because you held on to something else. I do believe that the example that I gave about a fighter and a lawyer, I do believe that that was maybe this analogous, but you still engage with it, and you said something which is, I don't think it's absurd, but I think it is a very weird view. You said something like, he wants to avoid suffering. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I think you said was, he wants to avoid suffering, not because, but I think that's what his attitude is, that he wants to avoid suffering, this qualia, right? But if you're reducing every single moral judgment on that, I think that is not, I don't think it's absurd, but I think that it's going to be very wrong. The same way that or maybe this is going to be off point, the same way I do believe that that is wrong. It's the same as how I believe that, like, egoism, or like reducing everything to I want to do it, therefore I should do it. I think that's also wrong to do. Like, you don't reduce it fundamentally to that to that attitude or that emotional or psychological state. Right? You can reduce it obviously in a way when it comes to, like, guilt, the Truman example that I gave, to guilt, or to some other form of emotional qualia, right? You can reduce it to that, but obviously I don't think that is in all cases. Like, I think that pain and suffering is just way more fundamental than just it's my attitude, right? It's like, even you agreed that it's rather a human tendency, right? Well, that is scary, because that's not really then an attitude, right? That's really something which is like, maybe you can even call it a reflex, right? Well, the reason why you would try to dodge a ball coming to your way when, like, somebody, like, shoots it from far away when you're playing, I don't know, like soccer, football, basketball, when you see a ball running at you like 30 miles an hour speed, obviously you're trying to dodge that. But why do you not just stand there, right? If you want to tell me that everybody has a preference to avoid pain, then that is something which maybe I'll even agree to from your perspective. I do not think that it's that absurd from your perspective. But if you just think that it's an attitude and not a reflex, that's something we could definitely get a touch on. Second thing, if moral facts, I think you made that claim, if moral facts were to exist, what do they explain better? That question is very, very hard to answer, but the way I think I came up with it is, let's just take anywhere from like 5-year-olds that can like fucking speak or whatever to a normal human being, like an average adult, doesn't matter, right? When you ask them, is the statement moon exists, hypothetically if cognitivism was true and moral facts are true, like what does that explain better? All right, is the statement killing is wrong true? Is the statement moon exists, is that statement true? Then they're going to tell, well, obviously, duh, moon does exist, right? But then if you ask them, well, then is also like raping being wrong, is that also true, right? And then they tell you, well, duh, it is obviously true. You see how you're going to get the same response from like almost everyone. I'm going to say universally, you're going to get the same response, right? But what does that conviction tell you? Like this moral obligation to the point where you would say, well, duh, it's obviously true. It doesn't matter when you're a realist or realist or anti-realist. What does this conviction tell you, right? To the point like where, well, why does this guy tell me the same way that moon exists, why does he tell me the same way that killing is wrong? Why does he tell me that they're both trivially true? And why does he show me such a conviction? And if you do not agree that it's universally agreed upon, I can send you the studies. But I think I already sent you DMs though. But if I didn't, I'll just send them here again. And the thing that I'm just trying to portray here is, what does that have to do with realism being something better? Well, how does a person account for this moral obligation? The same thing that, or like this conviction at least, to these being true or false, right? How does a person, like, how does somebody account for and then viewing such a trivial statement like moon existing and killing is wrong? Why does he think they're both trivially true, right? So I think that form of moral conviction or conviction to these statements being true, I think that explains better. I do think that it explains moral convergence better, right? I do believe that there is like a reason to why we converged upon killing being wrong the same way we converged upon the moon existing being a fact. Converged upon them the same, like I think, and maybe not even the same way, but it definitely explains it better, such in a way where, like, well, if it is a fact, then there is a reason why convergence, right? Why convergence would even exist, right? Well, according to law, bro. But yeah. The claim that you also wanted to talk about was yeah, I wasn't even referring to the truth, bro. I cannot think of from these people, bro. But chill out. Anyways, when it comes to, yeah, I wasn't specifically referring to, obviously a non-cognitivist doesn't hold to truth. I wasn't referring to the non-cognitivist explain this statement being true or this statement being false, right? How does he do it? I'm obviously not referring to that. I'm referring to, how does a non-cognitivist explain this something being good or being bad? Because you can hold to something being good or being bad without holding to that being true or false, in your view at least. So like, how does it then explain it in that sense when me and you are talking about it from this perspective? Like, how do you explain it better? And as far as it goes for the internalist view, I do agree with the view that moral statements are supposed to be motivating. Obviously they are. That's why they're normative statements. But that doesn't just automatically grant in a way non-cognitivism. Bro, chill the fuck. Oh, dog. But anyways, bro, wait, do you have, yo, Archie, do you have perms, bro? Mute Corey, bro, please.
Let me just, I had to give him his pills. He was just a little off. Excuse him. Go.
Yeah. So, basically, right, to continue or to finish off at least, you also gave a response to the how does it account for this universal and how it is just an attitude. But I think it led more into the suffering and everything. This is true because it's our attitude, which I think was the part which was absurd. In a way that, not even absurd, but I think it's just like fully wrong to say that, is because like, even in the dodge a ball example, when you would dodge a ball definitely to avoid suffering, but more because of our reflex, way rather than it's in your attitude to do it, right? So like, that is the fundamental point there. And again, if these propositions or these statements do exist under a stance-independent domain, it is then true as well that they would explain these things better to why we don't disagree on basic moral norms, why we did converge on the moral norms, why we feel the conviction to the moral norms, why there is like this obligation, why people also view moral quote-unquote moral facts and normal facts the same way about them being true, right? I think this is all way better explained under realism. So just to answer that point fully or shortly, so you don't lose it on the focus there. And maybe the last point to finish on, it's just my conclusion on the Friedrich Giesch problem, or in a way, like how these non-propositional utterances or this non-propositional language acts as a proposition, but just in like an imperative sense. If I understood what you were saying correctly, I do believe that that is true, but just in a way where, like, obviously, again, you can infer an imperative, but saying this imperative explains something better to the point where you would just say, well, non-cognitivism is true, I still don't see it. It's maybe it expresses better a psychological state. Maybe I can grant that in some cases, not even in all cases, but in some cases. But even that, I just do not see it. I just don't feel motivated enough to say that it explains something better. I just think that it loses out on parsimony. And if you want to say, well, it doesn't lose out on parsimony because you hold to truth value. You hold to sense independent reasons if you're like a realist. That's why you were even contending with those two. I think that I think that explaining how they would either explain something better or being indispensable, like instrumentally indispensable for the things that we're referring to. I think that if that is true that they are what I'm saying they are, I don't think that I'm really positing some entity in which I am losing out or I'm losing out parsimony. Rather, I'm giving something which makes my explanatory power way stronger. And if explanatory power is stronger, just so we're clear, if you posit more entities, but explanatory power isn't equal, then I don't care for the entities that are being posited, right? A kid can say, well, stars are some small shiny things in the sky, but if an astronomer comes with an explanation and holds to all these entities, like stars are actually very big celestial bodies in the sky with this heat, this amount of atoms, this mass, right? Even if they hold to all of this, I'm not going to reject him because he obviously holds way more explanatory power, right? So that's where I believe parsimony kind of becomes irrelevant, right? So just so I'm clear on that. But if in this explanatory power is equal, or even maybe posit a little bit more explanatory power, where does this parsimony that I'm talking about, how do you defeat that then? Because it just seems to me that this non-propositional language is kind of useless when it comes to explaining the meaning of moral statements or moral sentences. But yeah, that could be my closing if you're going to give your closing after this. If not, then sure, we can continue. But I think we can move to closings though.
Honestly, yeah, I was going to say, I don't mean to dismiss of what you said, but I feel as though there was nothing I really heard that I haven't already responded to. I felt all my previous accounts already addressed most of these issues.
Yeah. Fair enough.
I could have
Then I'm
explained it
just...
better, but I don't know.
Yeah, I can